Hi, and welcome to our thesis statement webinar. My name is Sammie Jo Coryell, and I work with National History Day in Minnesota. I primarily work with schools in southeast and south central Minnesota, but I do work with some metro schools, but I also coordinate our library programming. So today we're going to look at thesis statements and everything you need to know to help your students along in the process. We're going to cover what is a thesis, how do you write a thesis statement, some characteristics that are usually seen, what makes a good thesis, and how do you edit a student's thesis. So let's start with what is a thesis. A thesis is a historical interpretation that's supported by evidence. It's a roadmap for your project, and it's usually about 50 words. If a student is mentioning something in their thesis statement, we want to make sure that they're bringing it up for the rest of their project and not just leaving it hanging out to dry. Certain characteristics of a thesis statement include discussing the significance, being more than just facts, being specific, and connecting to the theme. So we'll look at these a little bit more in depth. First off, the significance. A student needs to discuss, so what? Why is your topic important in history? It's very easy to say that Jackie Robinson was a great baseball player, but it doesn't actually tell us what we need to know. Instead, if we were to suggest Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier, making it possible for African Americans to play professional sports, it's a little bit more of an argument, and that's what we're going to be trying to prove and why he was actually important in history. By being more than just facts, we ask students to use facts to come up with their own ideas about why a topic might be important. Vasco da Gama was the first European to reach Asia by sea. There's nothing to argue here, and we're asking students to dig a little deeper and to actually tell us what they're trying to prove. Instead, Vasco da Gama's discovery of an oceanic trade route to Asia led to an era of European imperialism. This is something that they're actually able to argue, and the research that they've done up until this point will be able to prove that. Being specific. Addressing a specific topic and make an argument about a specific impact in history is really important with History Day and with thesis statements because we don't want to be too broad. Martin Luther King Jr. changed everyone's lives forever. It's a very bold statement to make, but it's also extremely hard to prove. We don't know that every single person in the world's lives are changed, and we can't exactly say forever, so let's try to narrow it down a little bit. Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech brought national attention to the civil rights movement. This is about a concise point in history that we can clearly relate his I Have a Dream speech to the civil rights movement. And then also our theme connection. This year's theme is exploration, encounter, and exchange in history. So we want to make sure that we're connecting to that idea within the thesis statement right away. All three theme words do not have to be discussed in your thesis statement. We're asking that students pick a main theme word to focus on and to not try to force a connection with other theme words if they're not there. Students are going to be encouraged to talk about every E word that might be in their project, but not to force something if it's just not going to fit. They also might talk about one of those E words later on in their project, but that doesn't mean that it's important enough to be in the thesis. Let's look at an example of Gandhi. So we're specifically looking for these four characteristics. If we say in 1947, India gained independence from Great Britain, we're missing pretty much all four of these. This is very much just a fact. It's not telling us so what in history, and there's no theme connection. It's also not very specific because it just tells us about an event but not anything else about it. So it could be taken many different ways. So let's adapt it a little bit more. In 1947, India gained independence from Great Britain after a leader of the independence movement, Mahatma Gandhi, led protests. So this is definitely evolving. It's getting a little bit better. We're maybe going beyond the facts by saying that Mahatma Gandhi was the reason behind these independence movements, but there's still not a theme connection, and we're still not necessarily seeing that major significance in history. So we'll try one more time. In the 1900s, Mahatma Gandhi explored a new form of resistance by nonviolently protesting during the Indian independence movement in British-ruled India. Although Gandhi encountered opposition from Great Britain, his civil disobedience during the Dandi Salt March eventually led to India gaining its independence in 1947. Well, a little bit of a mouthful, you can see that this does have all 4 characteristics, specifically with Mahatma Gandhi and his nonviolent protests, knowing about the Dandi Salt March, and that's the specific reason that India gained its independence, but then also you can see the theme connection. With exploration right away in the beginning, and then also his encounter. But you'll notice that we didn't force that connection to exchange because it wasn't going to fit with this idea. So now that we've talked about what you use to, the characteristics you use to write a thesis, how do you actually write one? First step is to know that the thesis statement is pretty intimidating, but that once students break it down into different segments, they'll find out that it's not that bad. Usually the hardest part is starting with that blank piece of paper and just getting something to start with. It's also important that you're helping your students start writing the thesis at the right point in the History Day process. If students are still in that research phase and don't know enough about their topic, they're going to have a hard time figuring out what's important enough to go in their thesis and what they really need to emphasize. And then also, this is something that all students should really be able to relate to because they've been hearing these questions their whole lives: the who, what, when, where, and why. Who is involved in your topic? What is happening? Where is your topic taking place? What time period is your topic in? And why is this important? Discussing that significance. These are going to be those main ideas that students are talking about in their thesis statement. So if they can answer these questions, they're on the right track. Students are also going to have to decide between interesting and important. There's this idea of that the information they're researching and finding is so interesting and maybe they're so passionate about it, but knowing at the same time if it's important enough to include in their project. If something is also too important but doesn't actually relate to the overall theme, sometimes it's just boring. So we need to find the in-between of what's an interesting fact to talk about but important enough to include. And finally, you're going to go through several drafts before you get it right. Like I said, starting with a blank piece of paper is sometimes the most difficult, but once you start, you can always change it throughout the process. In fact, most students end up writing their thesis statement kind of as one of the first parts of their project, but it should be one of the last that they're editing, because as they learn more about their topic, something might change and they'll need to adapt their thesis statement to follow their research. So, what makes a good thesis? We know the characteristics that involved, and now we know how to write one, but how can you make one a strong thesis versus a weak one? Remember, I talked about using those theme words. Although you do not have to use all 3, we still ask that you put the actual theme words, exploration, encounter, or exchange, into your thesis statement so that it's very obvious for your audience to see the connection you're trying to make. Also want to avoid using first person. In 1941, Japan attacked us. Quite simply, us doesn't mean the same for you as it might for your judge or the other audience looking at your project. So we could instead say, in 1941, Japan attacked a U.S. naval base located at Pearl Harbor. This also helps with clarity so that everyone knows exactly who you're talking about and when. Also, don't ask questions in your thesis, answer them. Students have been working on this project for months and they've put a lot of hard work into it, so they're the experts on their topic, and we're asking them to teach us. In 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. Why do you think they would do that? As an audience person looking at this project, I would hope that the student is telling me why they think they would do that. This is also kind of a word eater in those categories like exhibits or websites that you have a specific word limit. You don't want to waste those words asking the audience something you plan to answer. So instead, stick to what you know. In 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor to prevent the U.S. fleet from interfering with their military actions in Southeast Asia. To avoid using present tense, most easily because it's not usually the time period your History Day project is talking about. It is 1941 and Japan is attacking Pearl Harbor. It's not 1941, Japan isn't attacking Pearl Harbor. It's also important for students to realize how academic writing varies from writing just for fun. So we'll want to stick to that past tense in saying, in 1941, Japan attacked a U.S. naval base located at Pearl Harbor. should, would, and could are words you should avoid using in your thesis, because History Day is about making a historical argument and being able to prove your point. We want to stay away from the philosophy. The U.S. should have entered World War II earlier. While you might be able to argue that we should have, you can't actually prove what would have happened if we did, simply because we didn't. So instead, stick to, again, what you know. The attack on Pearl Harbor led to the U.S. entering World War II in 1941. Similar to that idea of philosophy, we want to avoid what-if history. You need to focus on what actually happened. If the U.S. didn't enter World War II, Germany would have won the war. We simply can't prove this because the U.S. did enter World War II, Germany didn't win the war. So we need to stick to what students can back up using their research and historical evidence. So instead, when the U.S. entered World War II, they aided in the eventual defeat of Germany in 1945. Otherwise, if we encourage students to just talk about what they think, we end up with a real-life example that was found on a History Day project that says, without Winston Churchill, the whole world would have been controlled by the Nazis. We can't prove this, so we want to make sure that students stick to what they know, stick to what they've researched, and tell us everything they've learned about their topic instead. So let's try it. If we look at Rosa Parks as a good example in the bus boycott, we know that she was an African-American woman in the South during the early civil rights movement period, and she was riding a Montgomery bus when she refused to give up her bus seat to a white passenger. So let's think about that interesting versus important idea before we get started. You've done the research, so if we're looking at these 4 bullet points, we have to decide what's important enough to go in our thesis statement instead of what is just interesting. Knowing that her parents were James and Leona Macaulay is interesting to know, but what they had to do with the civil rights movement and her decision that day to refuse to give up her bus seat was probably pretty minimal, so that might not make it onto the thesis statement. However, on December 1st, 1955, Parks refused to give up her bus seat to make room for a white passenger. That's directly related to what happened after that fact, so that probably will be in our thesis statement. Likewise to knowing about who her parents were, knowing that she was born in Tuskegee, Alabama on February 4th, 1913 isn't necessarily as relevant. And also knowing that Parks was a devout Christian might show up later in your project as some of her motivations, but also not necessarily important enough to include right away in that thesis statement. This is an example of a very common thesis development worksheet that you might hand out to your students, or maybe you've seen from other teachers. And it simply breaks down the process for students so that sometimes it doesn't seem as daunting to them in the end. We ask that students identify the 5 W's, just determine their theme connection, and then pull that information together into a rough draft of a thesis statement. But then we also ask them for the evidence to support that historical argument so that students are held liable for what they're actually saying in the thesis they create. So if we were to walk through this thesis statement using Rosa Parks, our topic is going to be the Montgomery bus boycott. We want to know who was involved, who was affected, and for this one it's pretty straightforward. Rosa Parks, she's the one that started the action, the citizens in Montgomery, Alabama who were affected by the bus boycott, civil rights leaders, and Montgomery's government officials. All of these people were affected or somehow involved in her decision that day, so we'd list them all. Knowing what happened and what was the main event. This is very straightforward for students. We're not asking them to analyze anything, but just tell us exactly what happened and so they can identify that main point. Rosa Parks refused to give up her bus seat to a white passenger, which violated a law enforcing segregation on Montgomery City buses. Also, she was arrested and she went to jail. Civil rights leaders, including Martin Luther King Jr., organized a boycott of buses and challenged the law as unconstitutional. So you can see this is very straightforward, but we are asking students to just tell us what happened. Knowing where this event took place. For this example, it was solely in Montgomery, Alabama. However, students might find that their topic spans across many states or countries or even continent, depending on what they're looking at. And knowing when it happened and how long of a time period this was. Rosa Parks was arrested on December 1st, 1955. The boycott started on December 5th and lasted for 381 days. This example again is kind of a smaller period in time, but students shouldn't be worried if theirs lasts a couple of years or maybe even into a couple of decades. Getting a little bit more in depth though, we ask why. What caused this? Why did it happen? Civil rights movement leaders wanted to overturn segregation laws. And Rosa Parks attended training for nonviolent protests at the Highlander Folk School. Rosa Parks was, in fact, trained before this event, and she had planned on refusing to give up her bus seat that day in Montgomery. So this was like an action that those civil rights leaders took in order to cause a reaction among government officials. And then knowing why is this important, what were the outcomes? The boycott forced change in Montgomery and succeeded in overturning the law requiring segregation on public transportation. This success inspired other civil rights movement protests and helped Martin Luther King Jr. develop nonviolent strategies to fight segregation. This could be one of the most important questions that students have to answer before they actually write their thesis statement, so it's important that they develop this fully. So we want to make sure that students are making those meaningful connections, because otherwise we end up with Rosa Parks explored the city as she tried to ride the bus, and that's a pretty weak connection. She probably had done this multiple times before, and it's not going to show us anything significant in history. And it's pretty boring. With encounter, Rosa Parks encountered the police officer when she refused to give up her seat. That's also a pretty weak connection because we know that that was going to happen regardless, so we'd rather see something more meaningful there. So, no. With exchange, Rosa Parks exchanged money to ride the bus. This again is that very weak connection, and everybody does that, and it's not really what we're looking for with the History Day project, and nobody really cares either. So, if we think back to those meaningful connections and want to pull it together into a thesis statement, we could end up with, in 1955, Rosa Parks initiated a nonviolent encounter with segregation by refusing to give up her bus seat to a white passenger in Montgomery, Alabama. Her arrest allowed Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to explore nonviolent protest strategies during the 381-day bus boycott, which put him in the national spotlight as a civil rights leader. This is a thesis statement that would be many drafts in the making for a student, but we can take a look at it and see if it hits all of those criteria we're looking for. We have the who, what, when, where, and why in that first sentence. We ask how this topic changed history, and it's answered at the end. It's done in 56 words, so we're right around that goal area for what we were looking for. And then there's that theme connection. However, I'd again like to point out that we don't have exchange in here, even though we know that there's a strong connection. We're going to wait and talk about it later in the project. I'd also like to point out that sometimes for students, actually writing the thesis is hard. So if we go back to where we point out the who, what, when, where, and why, you can help your students break down thesis statements in a couple of ways. If a thesis statement is looked at as a two-sentence model, use that first sentence to really answer those who, what, when, where questions. Really get all that information out of the way. And then the second sentence can answer that theme connection, or it can talk about the significance a little bit more. So usually the first sentence is pretty easy for kids to write, and if they're able to get at least one sentence done, the second one will come a little bit easier for them as well. So, just like you make your students do things multiple times, we're going to try it again. This time we'll look at the Irish potato famine as an example for a world history topic and examine how this could be a thesis statement. We're going to talk about who, and in this case the focus is going to be on those Irish farmers. What happened, in case you're unfamiliar with this event, a great famine that began when potato crops were destroyed by disease. Many Irish immigrated to the United States in hopes of finding more opportunity and a better life. At this time in Irish history, potatoes were one of the biggest supplies of food for farmers, so this was devastating to the poorer population specifically. This generally happened in 1845 through 1852, so even you can see that it's a little bit longer of a time period than the Rosa Parks connection. Where it happened, we're also spanning across two different countries, Ireland, where that famine actually happened, and then the United States, where some of these farmers ended up immigrating to. But why did this happen? The famine forced the Irish to leave Ireland to avoid disease, starvation, and death. They immigrated to the United States for more stability while encountering political, social, and cultural upheaval in a foreign country. This is pretty in-depth. So let's look at a theme connection. They encountered death, and they explored how to find new food. Those don't seem very strong to me, but let's play it out and see where it goes. A thesis statement could look like, in the mid-1800s, a potato disease struck the country of Ireland, leading the Irish to encounter death in large quantities. These people had to explore new options for finding food until the famine ended. I don't think so. Let's stop. Let's go back and make that meaningful theme connection like we had talked about before. Instead, let's consider that the Irish encountered new struggles with the famine, including starvation, disease, and death. They explored new survival options in foreign lands by immigrating, and they exchanged cultural, political, and social impacts with other people. This already sounds like it might go a little bit better, and you'll see some of those aspects from the why question integrated into this theme connection. So a finished thesis statement that's quite a bit better. In the mid-1800s, a potato disease struck the country of Ireland, leading the Irish to encounter starvation, disease, and death. These people had to explore new options for survival, including immigrating to the United States. The political, social, or cultural impact those immigrants had was a result of their exchanges with other people living there. This is a much more solid thesis statement, and it's done in 55 words, so we're still right in that target range of what we're looking for. This is also another good example of a thesis statement that does include all three theme words: exploration, encounter, and exchange. But you might point out that they're not in that order. So students might find that their encounter comes before the exploration, and that's totally fine. We encourage them to find the theme connection that works for them and wherever it might work in their project. So next, let's look at editing a thesis statement. Students know how to write one. Hopefully they remember the characteristics that go into them. But then now it's your job as a teacher to help them hone that down to make it as strong as possible. We're going to look at a couple different ideas of how to edit thesis statements. Peer editing, which your students can do in a classroom where you could assign it as homework, making sure you're not rewriting for the student. Sentence diagramming, which is an interesting way for students to kind of work backwards in finding a theme connection, and then making sure to ask questions. A peer editing checklist could look something like this, where if you give the students a sheet of paper with checkboxes and they exchange their paper with someone else, we need them to look at the thesis that they're reading and ask, does this other student tell me the significance? And did they answer so what? Do I know why I care to learn about the rest of their project? Checking that theme connection, seeing if they're using the theme words in their paper, but then also making sure that the connection is meaningful. And then going back to those other characteristics, does this go beyond the facts? Is the student actually making an argument, and are they proving a point? Is it specific in history? And is it between 40 and 60 words? If you're having those students peer edit each other, the 40 minimum, 60 maximum is a good range for students to try and get a thesis statement into. This is important for teachers. Encourage students to do their own work and come to their own conclusions. It's so easy when you're looking at a thesis statement to just want to change it and make it better because you've written how many during your time as a student and as a teacher that it's easy to just make that changes for them. But we'd encourage you to instead let them draw out their own conclusions, which will come up again in a minute. Sentence diagramming is something that can be done in a couple different ways. In this case, we have a thesis statement that we're looking at. In the summer of 1961, protesters rode public buses into the South, hoping to initiate encounters with segregationists. Through the violent exchanges that followed, the Freedom Riders brought about the enforcement of Supreme Court decisions that banned segregation on interstate transportation and inspired others to fight for civil rights. So it's a pretty straightforward thesis statement, and if you hand this to the students, we're going to ask them to identify those key parts from the thesis statement development worksheet. So we'll have them point out the when in the summer of 1961, who the different protesters. What did they do? They rode public buses into the South, which is also our where. And then that theme connection with encounters and exchanges. And then at the end, the so what. So this could be a good idea to give students a couple different practice thesis statements so that they can identify them when they're looking at other thesis statements and then know how to integrate them into theirs. And then to help avoid with that rewriting, we need to make sure that you're asking students questions. How does your topic relate to the theme? If they can verbally tell you, it'll be much easier for them to put it into their thesis statement. What are you trying to prove? What's your argument going to be? Why are you telling your audience about this, and why is it important to know? Why is this so important for me to learn about? You want to make sure that students are able to identify these points so that it's clear for the audience and for you as a teacher to know the argument that they've been working on and researching for. And then finally, that so what idea. Making sure that students really understand we need to know so what about their topic. Asking questions is a great way to get students talking about their project, but also helping them understand how much they know about their topic. We typically find that students know a lot more than they say they do, so if you're able to have time to verbally have students answer your questions, you'll find, and they'll find, that they know a lot more, and the thesis statement writing could come a lot easier to them. So that covers the basics of our thesis statement webinar. We hope you find it helpful. My email is listed here at the bottom, so if you have any questions throughout the year or any students want to send me their thesis statements, I'm happy to look at them. But hope you enjoyed.